Hi, it's Rabbi Jeremy from Machar, and this is our Hanukkah candle lighting for the seventh night of Hanukkah in 2025. We talked a lot about different bits of how we do things with Hanukkah, or um, about the history of the holiday, or the role of women, or things like that. And I wanted to talk about another piece of Hanukkah history that I think most modern Jews lose track of because it's not really part of most of the ways that people mark Hanukkah, at least not in the modern period. And it's kind of interesting because it's the way that people 200, 300, 500 or so years ago would have known about the events of Hanukkah. Because the rabbis and the Talmud don't really preserve the details of the underlying story. And so you have to know about the events somehow, right? And what we've talked about before is that a lot of the way that scholars know about Hanukkah, modern scholars know about Hanukkah, is through Greek writings that are not part of the Hebrew Bible and are part of Catholic and Orthodox Christian scripture, right? The books of the Maccabees in particular, and to some degree, maybe the book of Judith. So, how exactly do you know about the events of Hanukkah in any kind of detail? And the answer turns out to be that Judaism does this thing historically over time where it looks at time somewhat cyclically. And it takes processes and it takes books and it takes practices that are already known and come from a source in one holiday and might pull them into another holiday. And that's what happened with Hanukkah. So if you know about the holiday of Purim, right? Purim falls in the late winter, early spring in the northern hemisphere. And Purim involves reading aloud the Megillah, or Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. Megillah just means scroll. And so the celebration of Purim involves reading that. And there are rules that the rabbis came up with for when you read it and how, and the trope and the melody and all these other things. Um, and so as people celebrated Hanukkah, over time, they adapted that practice of reading a scroll. And a book was written called the Scroll of Antiochus. Antiochus is the bad guy in the Hanukkah story, at least as it's traditionally told, the Megillah Antiochus. And so Jews wrote a book in Hebrew called the Scroll of Antiochus. And the Scroll of Antiochus reflects knowledge of the details of events that are reflected in the books of the Maccabees or in other Greek literature that nobody really recognizes as authoritative in a religious sense, but that provides us with historical background about events in Jewish history, and in particular, the Greek books written by a Jewish historian named Josephus. So Josephus records events that match pretty closely with a lot of things that are in the books of the Maccabees. And so the Megillah Antiochus, the scroll of Antiochus, becomes the source for a lot of Jews' knowledge of the events of the Maccabean revolt and the Hanukkah story, um, because they really weren't reading Greek literature and they really weren't reading apocryphal books like the books of the Maccabees, but that material comes in through the Megillah Antiochus, the scroll of Antiochus. And that practice of writing scrolls and using them as pieces of liturgy then extends out in other ways. So communities would read the scroll of Antiochus in synagogues. That reading of scrolls and that writing of scrolls happens during the medieval period in a lot of different places after different persecutions and marks communities' individual experiences with persecution and being saved or at least surviving persecution. So that's kind of what happened with Hanukkah for a lot of people is the scroll of Antiochus was written and read publicly, and that's how a lot of people learned about some of the details behind the story that we would know as the story of the Maccabean Revolt, as the story behind the holiday of Hanukkah. And so, having talked about that, we're ready to light our Hanukkah candles. It is the seventh light, and so I have our menorah set up with seven candles plus a shamash. I'm going to light it off screen because lighting on screen gets a little precarious. Lighting the menorah also gets a little precarious when it's not a very big menorah. So, better planning on my part next time would be a good idea. So, we have our lighted menorah. Nivarech et haor ba'olam, nivarech et haor ba'adam, nivarech et haor shel Hanukkah. Let us bless the light in the world. Let us bless the light in humanity. Let us bless the light of Hanukkah. And that is our Hanukkah candle lighting for the seventh night of Hanukkah in 2025. Chag Sameach.